Welcome to yet another episode of the Fourth World Podcast with me, Stellan Bäckman, Leif Jakobsson and Ola Persson, and today we are joined by anthropologist Cathryn Townsend. And Leif, you have some questions made for this interview, so let us begin.
Yes. I want to start this conversation by asking you, who are you really? And I have heard that you have done fieldwork among the Bakas, which is a hunter-gatherer people in Central Africa. This is my question. Who are you and what have you done in regard to these Baka people?
Okay, hi there. Yes, I'm Cathryn, and I'm an anthropologist. And I'm an anthropologist. Who am I as an anthropologist? I'm someone who, I'm a social anthropologist. So I'm from the sort of more British school of social and cultural anthropology. I grew up in South Africa. And I spent most of my adult life in the UK, but I'm currently, I'm on my second postdoctoral project in the United States. So I'm living in Texas at the moment. So, you know, that's kind of just about me personally. And then in terms of my research, I've long been fascinated in questions to do with egalitarianism, equality, inequality, especially gender equality or inequality. So those are the sorts of questions that have informed my research from like a very early point. And this is how I kind of got interested in the Baka, because the Baka are one of a group of hunter-gatherer peoples who are known in anthropology to have this history of being extremely egalitarian in their politics. So I was just really fascinated by that. Prior to studying the Baka, I had originally gotten really interested in this group of people called the Mbuti, who are also Congo Basin hunter-gatherers, but they live very far away. They live on the eastern side of the Congo Basin in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, whereas the Baka are on the western side, and they are kind of on the border between the Congo Republic and Cameroon. So not the Democratic Republic of Congo, but the other Congo. So like there's a lot of distance between those two groups of people, but yet they share some cultural similarities. And unfortunately, my first project with the Mbuti had some problems, so I had to kind of rethink things. And that's how I kind of got interested in working with the Baka, who I lived with for 2 years for my PhD research.
Could you say something generally about their life, also, so we know what we are talking about? Who are they?
Who are they? So they are a group of the Western Congo Basin hunter-gatherers. These people are sometimes also referred to by the term pygmy, which I don't typically like to use so much because I think it has some derogatory connotations that people aren't always aware of. And also because they've asked, like the Baka people themselves told me they don't really like that term. They are a group of, like their lifestyle today is that they do hunting and gathering in the forest in the Congo. And they also do a fair amount of farming these days. They have this sort of background of an egalitarian lifestyle, egalitarian politics, but today life is changing, and this was sort of the topic of my PhD research, was the social transformation They are no longer moving around in the forest doing just hunting and gathering. They're doing a lot more farming. They are sedentary now, so they live in permanent houses in a village. They spend a lot of time interacting with neighboring people, but they still, in many ways, have a lot of this egalitarian kind of ethos and ideology and political practice in their lives. So, you know, although things are changing, things haven't changed completely. There's still a kind of momentum to that egalitarian lifestyle from the past that's still very apparent.
Yes, you have talked about, for example, they don't practice when there were hunter-gatherers. They didn't practice polygamy so much. So the women had more freedom to choose their partners and so forth, and that's one of the aspects of egalitarianism.
Yeah,
That
exactly.
changed when they became farmers. And
I think definitely there's you know, and there's quite a lot of evidence of this in other similar kinds of groups. So it's interesting that the egalitarian hunter-gatherers tend to be a lot more monogamous than their neighboring peoples who are doing farming and have more inequality. And with that inequality, there's wealth inequality, and that wealth inequality tends to get used for some men who are gaining in status and wealth to take on second wives. So it kind of gets used as a way for some men to gain more mating opportunities, basically, if we're thinking of it in kind of evolutionary terms. But there's, you know, there's quite a lot of empirical evidence of this, and you know, even today with the Baka, the ideology about this is changing. So, you know, there used to be more of a sense that monogamy was a good thing, and you know, it's one man and one woman. And now there's, you know, like a lot of the women still don't really like the polygyny, but it's a lot more accepted.
oh yeah. Well, I have also understood when I have tried to understand the situation in Central Africa that they are discriminated and against
Yes.
from the neighboring peoples and so forth. And what is the reason really? Is the height of the people maybe one reason? People who are shorter, even our culture, is some kind of a derogatory thing and so forth. And can you tell us a little bit about the reasons for this discrimination and so forth?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, so I would definitely say that the shorter stature of the hunter-gatherer peoples, because they tend to be a little bit shorter than the farming peoples, is part of the whole story. But it's a lot more sort of like there's a bigger picture going on. So really, you know, the the current relationships between the farming peoples and the hunter-gatherers have changed over many hundreds of years of interaction between these two peoples. So it's thought really by the historians of the Congo Basin that the hunter-gatherer groups today, you know, are by and large the descendants of the original indigenous people in the area who did hunting and gathering and fishing in the rivers of the Congo Basin. And then when the Bantu peoples from Cameroon, from the grasslands area of Cameroon, started entering into the Congo Basin with their basic farming technology, which was yam cultivation, that there was a very synchronous, symbiotic rather, kind of relationship between these two groups of people. There was exchange relations, and you know, things were quite cooperative. And there's even a very widely spread kind of mythology about how the pygmies were our compass among the farming peoples in the Congo Basin. So they kind of remember this time when they relied very much on the hunter-gatherers to kind of help them adapt to life in the forest, whereas like they'd come from the grasslands area. And over the course of history, things started to change, especially in the 19th century. So in the early 19th century, you had the Atlantic trade going on, which involved slavery, and it involved expansion of the voyages of discovery, so to speak, of European countries. And there was the expansion of capitalism, and the slave trade was a part of it, you know, taking slaves from Central Africa, capturing people over there and taking them over to the Americas. That was a big deal. And it had a lot of knock-on effects throughout Central Africa, actually, because guns were introduced into the region, and there were like ways in which people could accumulate wealth through monopolizing these trade routes involving slaves and ivory and things that were desired in this Atlantic trade. They could kind of like become a part of that. And that led to the farming peoples kind of going for that kind of politics. And so there was war in the region, and there was gradually these big men really built up a lot of wealth and reputation, and you had almost like small states developing that were very hierarchical. And really that's when things started to change, and when this exploitation of the hunter-gatherers, who were kind of seen as you know, less powerful, maybe started to emerge. But then it was only like really in the colonial era, I think, where things like really, you know, changed dramatically, according to the historical sources that I've consulted about this. And that's when, you know, countries were kind of direct, European countries, we had France, we had Germany, we had Belgium in the Eastern Congo, like directly controlling the resources and exploiting that in various ways. And that led to, so in some cases, you know, the farming peoples were required to pay taxes in various forest goods that they collected, and they in turn then kind of transferred that to getting the hunter-gatherer peoples to collect those things like rubber and ivory and so on their behalf. And there was some exploitation that kind of emerged during that era. And then in the post-colonial era, there was urbanization and so on going on. There were extractive industries coming into the area, which also sort of like changed the dynamic a little bit, and led to maybe some competition actually between the hunter-gatherer groups and the farming groups, because in the past, the farming groups had kind of really come to rely on these hunter-gatherers for labor on their farms. And they couldn't really do that anymore, because the hunter-gatherers could kind of independently into those relationships with outsiders. So it became more coercive, actually, the relationship. The farmers started doing things like trying to, they like used alcohol, for example, as a way of locking people into relationships of cheap labor, like, you know, the hunter-gatherer does labor and gets paid in alcohol, and then becomes addicted to drinking this alcohol, and therefore, like, they kind of locked into that relationship of having to do the labor and being sort of dependent on the farmer for the alcohol that they're addicted to. So things like that started happening. And then with the extractive industries, they started setting up roads, and you get all of these outsiders coming in, and they are doing things like bringing in cheap alcohol in these little sachets. Most of it is actually poisoned with methanol. It's not good quality stuff at all, but people are very addicted, so they're using their wages because they're starting to become a part of this market economy and doing wage labor, and they're using that like just to buy alcohol. So some of the outsiders who are these little entrepreneurs setting up shops and so on are also sort of part of these exploitative relationships now very often. Not everyone is involved to the same extent, but there's definitely that pattern happening.
Talking about history, do you know something about the relationship? Now it's also, you know, the whites are maybe Chinese and so forth people, but I've heard from somebody that the white somehow developed better relationship with these Congo Basin hunter-gatherers than with other Africans somehow, that they made some kind of distinction between different people and so on. I don't know if it's true or not, but
well,
what were the relations between the whites and the colonialists and the hunter-gatherers?
Well, I'm not really sure about that because, you know, this whole kind of idea of racial hierarchy really entered into the ideology of the farming peoples as well. So they kind of borrowed a ideology that came from the Europeans about like a racial hierarchy, where you had white people kind of at the top of that hierarchy, because that was very popular. That was the sort of very common scientific belief at the time, at the start of the colonial era. You know, this was it kind of even facilitated the whole colonial enterprise, was the sort of idea of racial hierarchy. So at the top you had white people, and then you had various other kinds of people of color and so on, and then at the bottom of that hierarchy you had hunter-gatherer people, and pygmies in particular, and they were called pygmies, were seen as kind of at the bottom of this evolutionary hierarchy of more evolved people and less evolved people. And their shorter stature kind of really fed into that myth. And it's still, you still find that today. You still get people making these kinds of arguments. And I looked at that a little bit in my PhD thesis as well, about how this sort of ideology of scientific racism kind of affected the local racism that the farmers kind of have against the pygmies even today. So they kind of borrowed that from the Europeans, and the Europeans probably also have drawn on some of the local prejudices against hunter-gatherers. And then there you had the human zoos. So, for example, there's a book about one particular Mbuti, we think he was Mbuti gentleman, who was taken to a zoo in the Bronx in New York City. And
I know that. Yes.
Yeah. So, it's kind of like, I think subsequently, maybe white people have kind of seen the hunter-gatherers as a kind of more of a curiosity, and have been more sort of
I was thinking about that. They were maybe more exotic or something, and they this kind of thing.
And so I think maybe that led to different kinds of relationships as well, but I haven't really looked at that in depth.
Okay. Well, you have also studied the Mbuti people. That is in anthropology. They are famous by the writings of Colin Turnbull.
That's right.
And as I understand it, you think they were more egalitarian than the Bakas, because they were more hunter-gatherers still.
Yes,
This is the way.
Yeah, that's definitely the impression I got. But my sort of fieldwork period with the Mbuti was quite limited. I did it for my one of my master's projects. So I was there for a period of a few months. I can't remember exactly how long it was. And it was really very interesting, because they're still a very highly mobile people, and they still are doing a lot of music making and ritual stuff on a daily basis, which is a little bit different to how the Baka go about things, and the music making is more sort of inclusive in a way, because you get the men are singing and using a variety of different instruments and the women are also singing together. You get this polyphonic harmony. Whereas with the Baka, it's only really the women who sing, and then the men tend to do drumming, or at least the group that I lived among, had a more limited kind of music making tradition and more limited sort of ritual activities. It wasn't a sort of like everyday occurrence kind of thing. So that was interesting. And their way of life is just a lot more intimate as the result of living in these like little camps in the forest and moving around. So everybody is right on everybody else's doorstep all of the time. So, like the whole way of life is so intimate, as opposed to with the Baka, where they're living in these kind of clay houses, very similar to how the farming peoples live. And you get like an extended household living in one of those houses, but there is a certain amount of space between the houses and privacy between different households in a way. Whereas that's not the case with the Mbuti at all. Everything, you've got this very small enclosure where you sleep, but the rest of your life is out in the open in the camp, or you're out in the forest doing your hunting and gathering. So it just changes the whole social fiber of what life is like, if I can put it like that.
Oh yeah, and the leadership may be also different. It's not built on these very strong leaders maybe, and more of
Right.
consensus decisions and so forth. Or?
I think so. So like, it's interesting because the Mbuti do have these sort of informal leaders that they recognize, and from what I could tell, it does tend to be a man. There may be examples of women also acting as leaders, but it tends to be a man. But that person doesn't really have authority. They're more like just a person that's very charismatic and can be a sort of spokesperson and can do some sort of like like talking to outsiders on behalf of the group, and also being a spokesperson within the camp. One of the groups that I spent time with, the leader was a very young man, actually. He wasn't like an older man. I think he was in his early 30s or late 20s even. And he was just a really good storyteller. So, that may have been what contributed to them having him as the leader. So the leader doesn't really have a lot of authority. Whereas among the Baka, it's a little bit different. There's still not a huge amount of authority that the chief has, but what the chief does have is the authority of the state. So it's a recognized like government position that the chief now has, and that lends a little bit more authority and also more opportunities to kind of benefit from programs where the leader of the group is required to do outsider things, and then like he can kind of use that to build up his personal wealth and kind of set himself up as a big man who's got status and a bit more wealth. The rest of the group don't tolerate that too much, but like you can get away with a certain amount of it these days among the Baka, whereas I don't really see that. I didn't see that with the Mbuti at all.
Okay. Yeah, you were also talking very interestingly about what you call feminist mythology, that both men and women, they have a different kind of mythologies where they are on the top. So there's some kind of balance here between men and women.
Right.
Yeah. That's
So
very interesting.
I'm not the only anthropologist to have noticed this. It's something that social anthropologists are quite interested in with the Congo Basin hunter-gatherers, that their ritual and their mythology seems to be largely about exploring this relationship between men and women, and exploring the interdependent nature of the male and female gender roles specifically, and what's kind of seen as important for what's culturally given importance in the female gender role is that women have this reproductive capacity. They can have babies, and they bring up children and their mothers and so on. And what's seen as important in the male gender role is this ability to bring in honey. Honey is really very important, and it's, although women do occasionally do a bit of hunting of various kinds, they don't typically do honey collection. So that's a very male activity. But also the men's role in bringing in like very fatty meat of big game animals is seen as something that's to be celebrated. So a lot of the ritual is about that interdependence. And it's also about like exploring the idea of equality. So there's this kind of competitive, playful competitiveness between the two gender groups, where like the women insult the men and the men insult the women, and they've got their different special women's rituals and men's rituals. And there's kind of like this playful competition going on between them, where the men are saying we're more powerful and the women are saying no, actually we're more powerful. And because there's this back and forth, it kind of evens out, and it leads to this idea that, okay, we're more or less, we're quits, like there's equality between us in a way. But then, so yes, they, like the origins myth of the Western Congo Basin hunter-gatherers, specifically the Aka and the Baka, who they speak different languages that were borrowed from neighboring groups, but they have the same origins. Like they have part of their vocabulary is very similar. They have many of the same rituals. And they share this basic origins myth, in which the Aka have two separate versions. They have a women's version and they have a men's version. And the women's version is basically that the men and the women lived separately in the forest, and the women did their fishing and their foraging, and the men did their hunting. And the women had a spirit called the Ejengi, which is still a very important spirit in today's rituals. And the women kind of had the spirit who lived among them, and they could make babies by having interactions with the spirit somehow. But the men didn't have that. The men could only copulate with this hard fruit that grows in the forest, and they could have baby boys from copulating with this fruit. And then eventually the men and the women, somehow there were various different kind of versions of that, found each other. And there was one particular woman or man, depending on whose version it is, who found the other group. And then that led to the transfer of this Ejengi spirit, which the women had, to the men's group at the time that they decided to come to live together. And the women kind of decided that they liked the men because the men had honey, and they decided, well, these people are kind of nice because they've got this lovely honey that we'd never tasted before. It's so sweet and it's so wonderful. And the men, were really interested in these sexy women that they found. And so the women's version kind of goes, well, we have so many powerful spirits of our own that we decided to give this to the men because the men were so pathetic. They were copulating with this fruit, and it was so sad. And in our generosity, we gave the men the Ejengi spirit. And the men tell the story that no, they forcibly took the Ejengi spirit from the women, and now they're powerful as the result of taking that spirit. So it's interesting that among the Aka, who are a little bit more egalitarian still than the Baka, because the Baka, really, their history is one where they had a lot of state pressure to sedentarize and to do other things. So they are less egalitarian than the Aka, who are their close neighbors, really. But the Baka version of this myth that I came across, there only seems to be the male version that is still in the telling. So when I recorded this myth, I didn't find it a female equivalent. It was only about the men sort of telling this version of where they forcibly took the Ejengi spirit away from the women. And, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier about polygyny as well, about the transition from egalitarian kind of situations where you have monogamy to when you get inequality, polygyny tends to kind of creep in, and that is really a thing that is introduced by men who have built up some financial power. That in this Baka myth, the men's version, it's about polygyny as well. So it's about how there were so many women that each men got to have several wives. Whereas if you look at the Aka versions, it's very clear it's one man and one woman. They choose and pair off and go off together, and that's kind of like an important part of the myth. So like there's been obviously some changing along with the social transformation of the Baka political system. This mythology is also clearly like, myths change over time, and they represent the belief system and the ideology of the group of people. And so you see that it's kind of been elaborated upon probably by the Baka in that particular way to come to accommodate these new beliefs about that polygyny is actually okay, and it's something that men want. The women still don't really like it, but it seems that the women don't have the same power because they don't really have the same ritual power. They don't have the mythologies going that are widely sort of accepted in society. If they are telling these stories, it's kind of behind closed doors. So if there is a women's version of that myth, it's not like widely told in society. Maybe they get into trouble if they tell it. I don't know, but I, as an anthropologist living there for for 2 years, I never came across a women's version. And I also didn't find that the women were doing these female rituals which are described among the Aka and which are described among the Mbuti and other groups of Congo Basin hunter-gatherers who are more egalitarian still. So, that was kind of really interesting to me because my PhD research was about social transformation. And I looked at material things and goods and, wealth inequalities and that kind of thing. But I also looked at this kind of mythology and ritual aspect, which I find really fascinating.
Is the egalitarianism shown in other forms than the equality between the sexes, the genders? Are there other ways to show this egalitarianism?
I think that, it's interesting that the ritual and mythology tends to be about like the gender egalitarianism, but the other aspects of it seems to kind of just go with that. So you don't really have, although older people are venerated and they're respected, they don't have like some kind of special authority over younger people. And you see that even in parent-child relationships, that the children are giving a really quite astonishing amount of leeway and freedom, and they'll be running around in their own little age groups doing stuff, collecting food for themselves, playing with big knives at like a very young age. It can be quite shocking from an outsider's perspective to see the amount of leeway and anti-authoritarian kind of parenting that goes on. So that's one example. Another example is that, these leaders, if they exist, they're very they're not, there isn't really this idea that they can tell other people what to do exactly. They, like you can choose to lead. You can choose to follow a leader, but like if you don't want to, you can kind of generally just not do that, not do what's being suggested. And if it becomes problematic, you can just leave and you can go and join another group. So that's kind of one of the ways that they deal with conflict, is that there's this very fluid kind of group structure where, like, if you don't like what people are doing, then you can just leave because you've got kin and you've got friends in other groups, and you can kind of go and, do your own thing over there, so to speak. So there's not like this authoritarian kind of system of knowledge where you have specialists saying, well, if you want this knowledge, then you have to do things my way, or that just doesn't really happen. Leif, you have a question.
Yeah, what is very beautifully described by Turnbull, I think, is the relation to the forest and how they venerate the forest and so forth. And I think now they are involved in the Okapi project. They are involved in the environmental project also. And so
Yes. Okay. Yes. Well, that that is also happening. So there are a lot of outside elements that are increasingly coming into that part of the world, and there will be changes that come with that. But yeah, I mean, like Turnbull's book, the Forest People, is actually, it's so beautifully written, and like that book, The Forest People, was one of the things that really got me more interested in, you know, studying these Congo Basin hunter-gatherer societies and their egalitarianism, because he describes it so well. And as you say, the forest is seen as a sort of a giving parental figure. So they often describe the forest as the mother. The forest is our mother, and I even collected with the Mbuti. I collected some songs and so on that are saying that are celebrating our mother, the forest, in that way. And I think it's egalitarian because it's this idea that like the forest is sentient and is providing for us all as people, and like we're all free to go out there and use the resources of the forest to survive as individual people, and there's no one that can tell us, well, no, you can't use this, it belongs to me. You can't use that, it belongs to so and so over there. Everybody is entitled to that abundance of the forest because the forest is the parent. So it's like this elaborate ideology and cosmology, really, of egalitarianism. It's not limited to just some small element of political life. It's much bigger than that.
yeah. Well, we might also talk something about the project you're involved in. It's the Human Generosity Project.
That's right. Yeah.
Yes, yes. And in terms of generosity, you often hear people say that the lack of generosity among people, they just, if they just help their own kin and so forth, maybe that's some kind of evolutionary thing that according to Darwin, you are, you're just trying to survive somehow. And I'm not so happy with that suggestion, really. But at the same time, there is some kind of selfishness in human relation often. And how are you? What are you doing in the Human Generosity Project?
Okay, so maybe I'll tell you in a moment what I have been working on, because that's kind of interesting and goes back to Turnbull and all of that. But the question about the evolutionary side of things, I think people very often confuse two different dimensions of human life in a way. And I think even like some of the evolutionary biologists have done this, in that like you're mistaking how people think and their psychology and what's important to them and their value system for what's kind of happening in terms of evolutionary dynamics, and they're not the same thing at all. So like, just because over time we're going to get selection for certain traits that are going to aid survival, and that includes like how people cooperate, it doesn't mean that people are kind of calculating some kind of benefit that they can get from every social transaction and like selfishly plotting to kind of maximize what they get from others. That to me is not how it works at all. I think what's happened is that evolution has favored in a way this mindset that we have, that very often we just kind of want to help other people that seem to us to be good people, like other people in our environment, even other people in far-flung places in the world, even other species. We see them as being worthy of our help, because that like tends to be the psychology of a lot of us. I'm not saying everyone is exactly the same, But I think people kind of dismiss this idea that people can be genuinely generous because there needs to be some kind of evolutionary benefit. And I think that's one of the mistakes, if I can put it that way. So does that answer that part of the Human Generosity Project? So we are interested in the evolutionary dynamics and how it all makes sense in terms of like the fitness of people over time, but like we don't see it as being something that is going to make people calculating quite the opposite. Well, I see it personally as quite the opposite, actually. And then, so the work that I've been doing is really interesting because I never intended this to happen. But I started working with a group of people called the IC, who are in Uganda, and they also were a group of people that, you know, were largely hunter-gatherers and did a little bit of farming. And they became famous for being selfish because of a book written by Colin Turnbull, the very same person who wrote this wonderful book about, you know, the egalitarianism and the generosity and everything of the Mbuti. He wrote this book called The Mountain People, which is absolutely like horrible. It really like paints this group of people as being loveless, as being selfish, as, you know, doing shocking things, and of being a kind of people that have this culture that has really abandoned their humanity and abandoned our kind of social obligations to one another, even family obligations, you know. That was the portrayal in The Mountain People. And so this is very shocking. And the Human Generosity Project was looking at lots of different examples of cooperation around the world. And I think they got some criticism for cherry picking societies that are known to be generous in one way or another. So they kind of said, well, let's look at a society that has quite the opposite kind of reputation, and it's the IC. You know, they had because Turnbull was such a great writer, like he was a really good writer, this book became really famous, and so the IC had this reputation of being loveless and of not being generous at all, of actually being quite selfish and mean, and, you know, they really had that kind of reputation. But not a lot of work had really been done with that group of people because, again, it's in an unstable kind of part of the world. And so like there are very few anthropologists and linguists who've done research. There are a handful of us, but not a lot of work has been done there subsequent to Turnbull. So, you know, we were really interested in going, well, you know, is there any truth to this idea that the IC have a culture of selfishness? And so I was hired as a postdoc for the Human Generosity Project to go in and kind of look at that question, that, you know, broad question. And what I really found was that it's a misrepresentation of the IC. They don't really have a culture of selfishness. And if you think about it hard enough, it doesn't really make sense to have this culture of selfishness to the extent that was described by Turnbull, where he was saying, well, their culture is one in which it like makes them abandon their social relations, because a culture is really about creating opportunities for cooperation. That's kind of the role of culture. So what was going on there? And you can kind of actually, you know, like if you read Turnbull's The Mountain People critically, what was happening was they were in the midst of a very extreme famine in which people were starving to death. You know, like he actually describes that happening. So like by his own work, you can see this is not like a normal circumstance that's going on. What was true was he argued that they, you know, like due to colonial policies and so on, they'd been forced into a more encapsulated region, and they'd been forced out of some of their hunting areas and so on. And, you know, they were, as a result, they were struggling. They were struggling on the top of this mountain, and their range had been severely limited. And this was one of the things that had pushed them into a situation where like a famine could become so extreme, that was caused by a drought. So that was correct, but he interpreted the behavior which he saw, which included things like abandoning children to die of starvation and, all kinds of horrific stuff. He interpreted that as being a result of cultural adaptation to the harshness that they had experienced over a few generations. And I think that's fundamentally wrong, because if you take a cross-cultural kind of approach to that, and you look at any society, and there are a lot of examples that's been through an extreme and prolonged famine circumstance, you'll see the breakdown of society. You'll see all kinds of horrific things happen. You see cannibalism happening. There's evidence of those things occurring. So it's just unfortunate that, when people actually are starving, they lose the physiological capacity to cooperate. So it's not really anything to do with culture. It's to do with like the fact that you're starving today. Even if you wanted to help your neighbor, you can't do that. Your child is starving, you've got no food to give them. Like, there's not really much you could do about that. So to interpret that as being like the outcome of culture, I think was very, very misguided, actually. Although, I was always a fan of Turnbull, I came to really to kind of see this as being, this was a very big misstep, and it gave, it really like painted the Ick people with this horrible reputation, which they really don't deserve. So like, it's not what I experienced. I really liked the Ick people. They were hospitable towards me. They were generous, in allowing me to live among them, especially after having, like, because they know that they were described in this way, that's kind of reached their ears. And yet they're still prepared to kind of have an anthropologist among them. And, I did some economic experiments where I kind of, apart from my own description of the generosity of the Ick people, it's a kind of way of making that more quantitative and more objective and more sort of scientific in a lot of ways, that will be more acceptable to people that like numbers and like objective science, rather than me just my ethnography saying, well, no, actually the Ick are generous, they're not actually selfish today. And if they're not selfish today, and if all of this stuff about a culture of selfishness doesn't exist today, where conditions are still very harsh, by the way, then that whole like interpretation of Turnbull's really falls apart. And you've kind of got to look at whatever he wrote about the Ick as being within a very extreme context. So one of the problems was that we didn't have a lot of work among the Ick. There wasn't anything before Turnbull arrived, and then after that, there was very limited research as well. So that kind of led to this perpetuation of this reputation of the Ick, which still continues today. You still get people publishing using the Ick as an example of how, culture can make people more selfish, or make people behave selfishly, or that hunter-gatherers aren't really as generous as anthropologists say, because look at this example of the nasty Ick people, and so on and so on. So we should always be very, very, I think, cautious about just accepting the word of a single researcher and their interpretation, and buying hook, line, and sinker into a narrative like that, especially when it's like extraordinary claims that he was making about the Ick people. Yeah.
Yeah, I have just one final question myself. That is really, it's an interesting idea with the generosity project, but the university itself, isn't it very competitive, you think, and people are very competitive in the university environment, and also it's very fragmented. You have an anthropologist, you have a psychologist, you might have an economist, and so forth.
Right.
And that is a little bit maybe contradictory to that. Isn't it problems with the relation itself? And yeah.
I suppose you could look at it that way. I mean, I am somebody who politically I am very egalitarian, which is kind of why I got interested in this whole thing in the first place. And I really dislike the hierarchy that you find in universities, and I dislike the sort of competitive nature of scientific research, where you're kind of forced to, you know, publish stuff all the time. And I think it leads to actually like some not very good quality research, because the important thing is that you just produce these papers all the time and that they get cited by other researchers. And, you know, it's changed the nature of anthropology, because you're not going to be able, you know, with the competitive nature of academia, you're not going to be able to make a career for yourself if you're living with people for years on end just to like produce an ethnography at the end of this. And, you know, like what you really need is academic papers. So like, you know, like your PhD, you get a limited amount of time that you can, like 2 years that I lived with the Baka is really like quite a long time by a lot of anthropological standards these days. It's not typically that long, you know, it can be as little as 6 months. It's normally about a year, sometimes a year and 6 months. 2 years is quite unusual, you know. And in 2 years, I couldn't really like learn the language as well as I would have liked to. You know, I was still an outsider. There was still a lot of things that I really didn't understand. And so, you know, and then after that, I switched to the IC because, okay, yes, I got really interested in this issue of cooperation and generosity as the result of my previous research. But it was also like, this was, you know, this was an opportunity as a postdoc that I could take, whereas there wasn't a clear opportunity to continue the work with the Baka or whatever. So like what you're studying and what you're doing and how you go about it gets shaped by that competition. So, you know, that's just a comment about the whole academic system. But I think it needn't necessarily prevent us from trying to look at generosity, you know, from an objective, more scientific kind of point of view, and trying to understand it, and even trying to use those lessons to make the world better, to enhance cooperation in the modern world, and to learn from, you know, like how people have these traditional ways of cooperating and organizing on a small scale, and how we can kind of think about those strategies and employ them on a larger scale to solve some of the problems that we're facing as a global society, because we are increasingly like facing global problems together. So, you know, you have climate change and all kinds of environmental challenges, and cooperation is going to be key. And generosity towards each other, I think, is going to be key in how we deal with that and whether we succeed in dealing with those kinds of issues. So like, I think it's important to try and, you know, study it scientifically in a way that will be acceptable to a lot of people who have that kind, you know, that's how they value knowledge, you know. And I think there's a lot of good to doing that.
Who are involved in this project? Are the scientists, or what people are involved?
Yes. So it's a multidisciplinary project. The two directors, the one is Lee Cronk, who is an anthropologist who, you know, like has done also some very interesting work in Africa. He started out also looking at a formerly hunter-gatherer group in Kenya, the Mukogodo people, and, you know, he really became interested in the Mukogodo people. Kind of got absorbed into a pastoralist herder community, the Maasai, who you may have heard of. And so he started like really understanding and also studying Maasai culture. And he became interested in particular in the Osatua system, which is a system of need-based giving, which doesn't actually match up to some of the reciprocal models that were being used in evolutionary understanding of, you know, of how altruism might exist in human societies. So like he got really interested in that, and he, along with Athena Actopus, who is a psychologist who is more interested in modeling this cooperation and stuff like that, formed the project. And then like various people were kind of brought onto the project from psychology and from anthropology as the result of that. And, you know, like there's economic theory in there as well. There's, you know, like it's a multidisciplinary kind of venture. Yeah.
Stellan, do you have a question or something?
Not really, actually.
Okay.
Are you done with your questions, Leif?
No, I'm satisfied. I think they have given a very good answer, and I think it's a very interesting conversation we had, and thank you very much for this conversation, really.
Thank you so much for your interest in my work, and I really enjoyed this discussion. And
Yeah.
if you have any questions further down the line, you know where to reach me. Like if anything pops up that is unclear. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, and I'll be watching, what your organization is doing in the future. I think it's great. We need more Indigenous rights organizations. So, good job.
Okay.
Thank
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very
All
much.
Cheers.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Baba